Okay, and welcome back. So we're going to go over some concepts in the completing the square algorithm. These are just concepts to either strengthen what you know, remind you of something that you already know, or just a quick review. Okay, so there's going to be two situations as an algebra student where you're going to need to use the completing the square algorithm. One of them is to solve quadratic equations, and the second one's for graphing. Okay, and you can cover your ears if you don't want to hear this. But as a calculus student, you're going to do something called integration. And what you'd want to do is obtain a relation for the substitution that you'll be doing. So considering this is just for algebra, we're just going to ignore that. I'm not even going to write it down. Okay, so the first concept has to do with factoring. So this factoring is for the more complicated problems where you have a coefficient that is anything but 1 on the x squared term. So for example, let's say you had something like this. Then, as you know, you move the 9 over to the other side to get this. And you put blank spaces there, right? Then what you're going to do is factor the 3 out, right? So now you take half of the middle term, which is this 2, or it doesn't matter what number it is. You just take whatever number you have there, and then you divide it by 2. Then you square it. And in this case here, this one's simple, so it's just 1 quantity squared. And so we'll write that in here, and then we'll simplify it on this side. However, when we do that, this is where most people get their points taken off. This is where things go bad. That 1 is going to be multiplied times the 3, which means that when you add to both sides, you're actually just adding the 1 squared here, and over here, you would add the 1 squared, but it has to be multiplied times the 3, so you get 3 times 1 squared, right? For those of you that are wondering how in the world that works, what you're actually doing is adding 0 to the inside of the main set of parentheses by adding 1 quantity squared and minus 1 quantity squared. The only thing you're doing is multiplying that 3 times the negative 1 quantity squared so that it comes out of the main set of parentheses as negative 3 times 1 quantity squared. Then you're moving that over to the other side of the equal sign as positive 3 times 1 quantity squared. Now, if you're wondering why do I leave the squares in there, that's something that I explain in the next tutorial. However, for right now, you can understand 1 squared is just 1. And on this right side here, I don't have to write it like that. I could just say, well, 3 times 1 squared is just 3, right? Just for you, I'll write it in. All right, so that takes care of factoring. The second concept is fractions. And this actually has to do with what we kind of just did right now with the middle term. Let's say, you see, this one was easy because it's a 2, but let's say you had something like a 5, right? Meaning that it's not an even number, but an odd number. So, no, do not write 2.5. Instead, what you do is just put it over 2, and then you square it, right? And to make matters worse, let's say, for instance, you had something like 3/5, right? And so instead of this 2x, right, I'm talking about this right here, this 2. So instead of that 2 in front of the x, you had something that said 3/5, right? This is so simple. All you got to do is just write it this way and just put it over 2. Don't even mess with it. Now, if it looks funky and you don't like the way that looks, well, I'm sorry, but I'm trying to do it so that way you don't have to do any math. Like, literally, all you're doing is just moving it's like moving little Lego blocks around. That's it. Now, if you are somewhat inspired by the way I wrote that and just think like, well, okay, maybe there's some kind of trick to this, I wouldn't call it a trick. I would just say it's a technique. Essentially, when you're dealing with fractions, that's actually the easiest thing to do. You don't even have to mess with decimals. Like, definitely do not use decimals. And if you do use decimals, I'm going to tell you right now, you're going to have to start converting things to improper fractions at some point. So you want to just avoid all that by just leaving everything as fractions. And with what you already know, you know that the 5 and the 2 are going to multiply, because when you have a fraction on the top over a whole number on the bottom, the denominators just multiply, right? So you'll end up with just 3/10. And then from here, you can go ahead and square. So that takes care of fractions. The next thing would be exponents. And for this one, well, let's go back to the 3/10. And you're going to square that. This is simple. In fact, I think most of you guys already know this, but for those of you that still are maybe a little confused, just raise the 3 to 2, same as the 10. And this becomes 9/100ths. And the fourth concept truly is just a reminder. So let's say you're at a point in the problem where it looks like this, but I'm going to move everything up just to make a little bit of space. And that concept is square roots. So let's say you're at a point in the problem where you have to take the square root. And when you take the square root, here's something that you should keep in mind. Due to the symmetry of the quadratic function, you're going to end up with two different answers, which means you have a plus or minus. So that's basically it. So when you take the square root of both sides, I'm going to write this in red to remind you to take the square root of both sides. So don't forget that. Please don't forget that. I would say most of the points that are taken off are for number 1 and number 4. Those two concepts are pretty much the ones where most people mess up the most. And that pretty much covers everything. So now we can start working on some techniques, and we'll do that in the next tutorial. And as always, guys, good luck with your homework and tests in the future, and thank you for watching.